My name is Claire. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've worked quietly in operations and financial coordination. One of those roles people only notice when something goes wrong. I live alone, I pay my bills on time, I don't post much online, and I've never been particularly good at explaining myself in rooms where people speak loudly and confidently about their success. If you were to meet me casually, you might assume I'm cautious, maybe even timid. Some people mistake my silence for uncertainty. Others rate my simple clothes and practical choices as a lack of ambition. In my family, especially, I was often described with words like low maintenance, easy, or grounded. Labels that sound kind on the surface, but quietly place you beneath expectation. This story isn't about a single insult or one dramatic explosion. It's about something slower, and in many ways more painful. It's about how humiliation hurts more when it's dressed as honesty, when it comes wrapped in concern, laughter, or just telling the truth. When the people who know you best decide they understand your worth better than you do and feel entitled to announce it publicly. Several years ago, at my cousin's wedding, my own mother publicly shamed me for being poor. She didn't shout, she didn't curse, she didn't intend to be cruel, at least not in the way people imagine cruelty. She smiled, she joked, and the room laughed with her. What followed wasn't revenge, and it wasn't a dramatic confrontation. There were no speeches, no walkouts, no viral moments. What followed was something quieter, a long process of seeing clearly, choosing silence deliberately, and letting reality do the work that anger never could. This is a story about emotional justice, not the kind that punishes, but the kind that rebalances, about quiet dominance, not through force or humiliation, but through restraint, preparation, and self-respect. It's about psychological reversal that happens, not because you demand it, but because others eventually collide with the truth they helped create. I'm telling this now not to expose my family or to position myself as a victim. I don't believe in villains or heroes here. I believe in systems of behavior, in unspoken roles, and in the moment when someone finally decides to step out of the one they were assigned. If you've ever been underestimated by people who claim to love you, if you've ever been embarrassed under the guise of just being honest, if you've ever wondered whether silence can be strength instead of weakness, then maybe this story will feel familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized, much later, that the moment that changed, you didn't look dramatic at all while it was happening? To understand what happened at that wedding, you need to understand who I already was to my family long before that day. In our family ecosystem, everyone had a clear position. My older cousins were the successful ones. Lawyers, consultants, people whose job titles sounded impressive even when you didn't fully understand what they did. The younger ones were full of potential. My aunt was the organizer, my uncle the storyteller. And my mother was known as practical, blunt, realistic, the one who told it like it was. And me? I was the quiet one who did fine. Not exceptional, not struggling, just fine. I paid my rent. I didn't ask for money. I showed up on time to family events with a modest gift and stayed to help clean up afterward. I listened more than I spoke. I answered questions politely and didn't volunteer details unless asked. Over time, Claire is independent slowly turned into Claire doesn't need much, and then into something more subtle. Claire doesn't expect much. I didn't realize how complete that transformation was until much later. At family dinners, people asked about promotions around me, not to me. When money came up, conversation shifted slightly, as if I wasn't part of the same category. When weddings or trips were discussed, there was always a quick glance in my direction, followed by someone saying, "Oh, but it doesn't have to be anything fancy." No one ever said I was poor. That would have been rude. They said I was simple. They said I was low-key. They said I was not materialistic. And I let them. Partly because it didn't feel worth correcting. Partly because I had internalized the idea that wanting more, space, respect, acknowledgement, would somehow make me ungrateful. My mother played a central role in this without ever seeming unkind. She spoke about me often, always in my presence, always with a tone of affectionate realism. Claire's happy with very little. She doesn't care about brands or status. She's not like the others. She's more grounded. People smiled when she said these things. They nodded. It sounded like praise. But praise, I learned, can still shrink you. By the time my cousin announced her wedding, the image of me was already set. I was the dependable background character, the one who wouldn't cause issues, the one who wouldn't need accommodations, the one who would understand if things were tight or if expectations were lowered. No one asked me about my dress. No one asked if I was bringing a guest. No one asked where I was staying. Those questions were reserved for people whose presence was considered delicate. I booked my own hotel. I chose a simple dress that fit well and didn't draw attention. I arrived early, helped my aunt arrange place cards, and smiled at relatives who commented on how nice it was to see me, as if I were a surprise. I didn't feel anger then, that's important to say. I felt something closer to acceptance, a quiet understanding that this was how I existed in their mental map. Invisible but useful, present but not centered, safe to speak about, rarely spoken to. I told myself it didn't matter, that I knew who I was, that external perception was shallow, that confidence didn't require recognition. All of that sounded mature, enlightened even. But what I didn't realize yet was this. When you allow people to underestimate you long enough, they stop seeing you as someone capable of being hurt. And when that happens, honesty becomes a weapon, because no one believes you'll object. At that point in my life, I thought being underestimated protected me. I believed it kept expectations low and conflict minimal. I didn't yet understand the cost. The first cut didn't happen at the wedding. It happened months before, in a way that was easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention, or if you trained yourself not to react. My mother and I were having coffee together one afternoon, just the two of us. She had been talking about the wedding plans, the venue, the guest list, all the little details that seemed to excite her more than they did my cousin. I listened, nodded, and asked the right questions. At some point, she paused and looked at me over the rim of her cup. "You don't need to worry about any of that expensive stuff," she said casually. "Just come as you are, no pressure." I smiled automatically. "Okay," I said. She didn't mean harm. I knew that. In her mind, she was being considerate, practical. She was removing a burden I supposedly didn't want or couldn't carry. But the comment lingered. Not because of what she said, but because of what she assumed. That I would worry. That I would feel out of place. That cost was something I needed to be protected from. It was a small moment, one of those that passes quickly, leaving behind a faint sense of discomfort you can't quite justify. And like most people who are used to being the reasonable one, I justified it for her. She's just being thoughtful. She knows how weddings can get. She's trying to make me comfortable. Later that week, at a family dinner, the same tone appeared again. My aunt mentioned the hotel block reserved for guests. My mother waved it off before I could respond. "Oh, Claire will probably find something cheaper nearby," she said with a light laugh. "She's good like that." Everyone nodded. No one asked me if that was true. I laughed too, softly, reflexively, the kind of laugh that signals agreement without enthusiasm. In that moment, I felt a quiet sting, not sharp enough to confront, but precise enough to remember. Because the truth was, I had already booked the hotel, the same one as everyone else. I could afford it without stress. I had simply chosen not to announce it. And yet, in their minds, a different version of me had already checked in somewhere modest, somewhere appropriate. The thing about these small cuts is that they don't bleed. They don't disrupt the conversation. They don't demand care. They just accumulate. Each assumption reinforced the last. Each comment framed as kindness made it harder to object without seeming ungrateful. If I corrected them, I'd sound defensive. If I stayed silent, I confirmed their narrative. So I stayed silent. At the time, I believed silence was maturity, that letting things slide was evidence of confidence, that I didn't need to prove anything. But there was another layer I didn't want to admit yet. I was afraid that if I corrected them, they'd laugh it off anyway. Afraid they'd say I was being sensitive. Afraid they'd say it was just a joke. Afraid that my discomfort wouldn't be taken seriously because it never had been before. By the time the wedding weekend arrived, these assumptions had hardened into expectation. I was expected to be easy, flexible, undemanding. And when someone is expected to absorb discomfort quietly, people feel entitled to test how much they can place on them. The first cut didn't change me, but it marked something important. It was the moment I began to notice the pattern, not emotionally, but intellectually, like observing a behavior repeat itself just often enough to recognize it wasn't random. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt alert, And sometimes, awareness is the most dangerous thing you can develop in a system that relies on your silence. Once you notice a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. What surprised me wasn't how often the dismissals happened. It was how smoothly they blended into everyday conversation. Nothing about them sounded cruel. Nothing about them broke social rules. That was what made them so effective. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, the comments became almost routine. Someone would mention the bridal shower gift registry, and my mother would say, "Claire won't need the link. She'll just do something simple." A cousin joked about destination weddings being a nightmare for people on a budget, and glanced at me before adding, "No offense." Always followed by a smile, always followed by laughter, always followed by my silence. I started to notice something else too. My reactions, or lack of them, were being used as proof that these assumptions were correct. Because I didn't object, they felt validated. Because I smiled, they felt kind. Because I stayed calm, they believed I was unaffected. There's a strange logic in families where roles have been assigned for a long time. If you suddenly resist, you're not seen as asserting yourself. You're seen as disrupting harmony. And I had been praised my entire life for not disrupting anything. So I rationalized. I told myself that correcting people would be petty, that their opinions didn't define me, that I didn't want to make things awkward before a wedding. Most of all, I told myself that my mother didn't intend to hurt me, and that was true. But intention doesn't erase impact. It just makes the impact harder to name. The day before the wedding, while we were helping set up the reception space, someone asked my mother if she was excited to see everyone dressed up. She laughed. "Well, most of us," she said, glancing at me. "Claire's not really into all that." Something about the way she said it, so confident, so certain, made my stomach tighten. Not because she was wrong about my preferences, but because she had turned them into a limitation. I wasn't choosing simplicity anymore. Simplicity was being chosen for me. That was the moment I realized how deeply the role had been normalized. Not just by them, but by me. I had been participating in my own erasure. Every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace, I made it easier for them to speak over me. Every time I laughed along, I taught them what was acceptable to say. And still I didn't speak up. Not because I was weak, but because I was calculating in a way I didn't yet fully understand. There's a kind of silence that comes from fear, and there's a kind that comes from observation. Mine was shifting. I began to watch how people reacted to one another. Who could interrupt without consequence? Who could joke at whose expense? Who was protected? And who was elastic? I noticed how my cousin, the bride, was treated with careful politeness, how her feelings were anticipated before she voiced them. I noticed how my older cousins were deferred to when they spoke, even when they said very little of substance. And I noticed how easily humor was used to keep me in place. Humor is a powerful tool. It makes cruelty deniable. It recruits the room as an accomplice. It frames resistance as an overreaction. If I said something, I'd be too serious. If I didn't, the joke became fact. So I stayed in the familiar middle. The thing about normalizing disrespect is that it changes your internal baseline. You stop asking, "Is this okay?" and start asking, "Is this worth addressing?" And most of the time, the answer feels like no, because addressing it costs energy, emotional risk, and social capital you may not have. I told myself I could handle it, that I dealt with worse, that it was temporary. But what I didn't realize yet was that every unchallenged moment was quietly preparing the ground for something much larger. Disrespect doesn't usually escalate suddenly. It grows confident first. By the morning of the wedding, my role was no longer implied. It was fully formed. I woke up early in my hotel room, the one no one knew I'd booked, and stood by the window, watching the city come alive. I remember feeling unusually calm, not excited, not anxious, just steady. At breakfast, my mother was already in organizer mode, directing relatives, checking timelines, and reminding people where they needed to be. When she saw me, she smiled with relief. "Good," she said. "I knew you'd be on time. Not happy to see you, not you look nice, on time." That was my function. Throughout the morning, people handed me tasks without asking. Could I hold this, watch that, run this upstairs? I did them efficiently without complaint. No one checked if I wanted to sit. No one asked how I was feeling. No one wondered if I needed help. I was reliable. And reliability, I was learning, often comes bundled with invisibility. As people got dressed and excited, I became part of the background movement. Necessary, unnoticed. When photos were being organized, someone waved me aside gently. "Oh, we'll grab you later," they said. "Right now, it's just immediate family." I was a member of the immediate family, but not in the way that mattered. I didn't argue. I didn't correct them. I stepped aside with a small smile and watched as people arranged themselves into neat, meaningful rows. In that moment, something crystallized for me. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about respect in the conventional sense. It was about usefulness. I had been assigned the role of the person who made things easier for everyone else by needing less, expecting less, and taking up less space. And I had played it well. My mother reinforced this role without realizing it. Whenever someone expressed concern about logistics or cost, she gestured toward me. "Claire doesn't mind," she'd say. "Claire's flexible. Claire's low maintenance." Each statement sounded like praise, but together they built a cage made of goodwill. I began to understand something important. People don't mistreat you because they think you deserve it. They mistreat you because they believe you'll absorb it. And I had trained them to believe that. Standing there in that busy, beautiful chaos, I didn't feel angry. I felt replaced. As if my inner life, my effort, my discipline, my growth had never been part of the equation. As if my value existed only in relation to how little I required. I looked around at the people laughing, adjusting ties, fixing makeup, basking in attention. And for the first time, I didn't wish I were them. I wished I were unassigned. That realization didn't come with tears or confrontation. It came with a quiet detachment, a sense that I was finally seeing the system clearly enough to step outside it, if I chose to. At that point, I still hadn't decided what to do. I didn't yet know how things would unfold. But I knew one thing with certainty. I could no longer pretend this role was accidental. And once you see the role you've been given clearly, you face a choice. Continue performing it or stop. The shift didn't happen during the ceremony. It didn't happen during the vows or the music or the applause. I sat in my seat, listened, and smiled at the right moments. From the outside, nothing about me changed. The shift happened later, during the reception, in a moment so quiet that no one else noticed it at all. Dinner had just been served. People were relaxed, glasses half full, the energy warm and loose in that way weddings often are once the formalities are over. I was seated at a side table with extended relatives, people I saw only at events like this. My mother was standing nearby, talking animatedly with a group of guests. I wasn't paying attention until I heard my name. "Well, at least Claire knows how to keep things simple," she said with a laugh. "She's never really had much money, but she's happy. Aren't you?" There it was, not whispered, not said privately, said clearly, comfortably, as if it were an established fact. The table went quiet for half a second, the kind of pause people barely register. Then someone chuckled. Another person nodded sympathetically. I felt heat rise in my chest. Not explosive, but sharp and contained. My first instinct was to explain, to correct, to say something factual, measured, and reasonable. But something stopped me. I looked around the table, at the polite smiles, in the way no one met my eyes long enough to invite a response. And in that instant, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a performance. My mother wasn't sharing information. She was reinforcing a narrative, one that made her practical, generous, and honest, and made me small in a way that required no accountability. And the room accepted it because it was familiar, comfortable, easy. If I pushed back now, I would be the one causing discomfort. I would be the one making a scene. That realization changed everything. I didn't respond. I didn't smile either. I simply took a slow sip of water and let the silence do what it wanted to do. My mother glanced at me, just briefly. There was a flicker of uncertainty there, quickly replaced by confidence when I didn't challenge her. The conversation moved on, but inside me, something had shifted permanently, not into anger, into clarity. I saw, with startling precision, the power dynamics at play. How public humiliation could be framed as truth-telling. How my silence had been mistaken not just for acceptance, but for permission. And I realized something else, something deeply unsettling and deeply freeing. If I could be diminished publicly without anyone feeling uneasy, then my dignity did not exist in that space, which meant I had nothing left to defend there. The urge to explain evaporated. So did the need to be understood. In its place came a calm resolve. I stopped trying to correct their perception of me. Instead, I began to detach my sense of self from it entirely. The rest of the evening passed without incident. I danced when asked. I congratulated my cousin sincerely. I thanked my mother for her efforts. No one noticed anything different, but I did. That was the night I stopped confusing silence with endurance. I realized that staying quiet didn't mean staying still. And sometimes, the most decisive shift happens the moment you decide that you will never again try to prove your worth to people who benefit from underestimating you. After the wedding, life returned to its usual rhythm on the surface. I went back to work. I answered emails. I kept my routines intact. When relatives called to talk about how beautiful everything turned out, I agreed. When my mother mentioned casually how proud she was of how easy I'd been throughout the weekend, I thanked her. From the outside, nothing had changed. But internally, my silence had a new quality to it. Before, I stayed quiet because speaking felt pointless or risky. Now, I stayed quiet because I was choosing to observe. I began to notice how often people filled the space I left open. How quickly assumptions rushed in when I didn't correct them. How comfortable my family was speaking for me instead of with me. And I let them. Not out of resignation, but out of strategy. There's a moment when you realize that correcting a narrative too early only strengthens it. People argue, they defend, they double down. But when a narrative goes unchallenged long enough, it starts to solidify into something brittle. That was the stage I allowed them to reach. My mother continued telling her version of me, that I was getting by, that I was content without much. I didn't think about the future in the same way others did. Each time she spoke, she revealed more, not about me, but about how she needed to see me. I listened carefully, not emotionally, analytically. I paid attention to the language she used, the patterns, the moment she chose to speak for me. The way she framed her comments was protective, even loving. And I noticed something subtle but important. She never asked. She never asked if her assumptions were accurate. She never checked whether I wanted to be represented that way. She simply assumed authority over my story. And authority, I was learning, only exists where it goes unchallenged. So I continued to challenge it, just not out loud. When my mother offered unsolicited advice about saving money, I thanked her. When she suggested I avoid certain risky decisions, I agreed vaguely. My compliance made her comfortable. Her comfort made her careless. Meanwhile, my silence gave me space to think clearly without emotional interference. I stopped feeling the urge to be seen. I stopped hoping for validation. Those desires had only tethered me to a system that diminished me. Instead, I redirected my energy. I started documenting things, conversations, patterns, financial arrangements I'd previously ignored out of trust or habit. Not because I suspected malice, but because clarity requires evidence, not intuition. At work, I was already skilled at this. I knew how systems functioned when people assumed someone else wasn't paying attention. I applied the same discipline to my personal life. Silence, when chosen, is not passive. It's a pause that allows you to gather information while others reveal themselves freely. And that's exactly what happened. My family mistook my quiet for acceptance. My mother mistook it for gratitude. No one imagined that I was stepping back not to disappear, but to see the whole picture without distortion. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing to stop being available in ways that cost me my dignity. And I understood something else too. When people are used to you absorbing discomfort, the moment you stop, without explanation, it unsettles them far more than any confrontation ever could. But that would come later. For now, silence was no longer something imposed on me. It was something I wielded. What my family never noticed was how much space their assumptions gave me. Because while they were busy deciding who I was, they stopped paying attention to what I was actually doing. I have always been methodical. It's part of why I gravitated toward operations and financial coordination in my career. I understand timelines. I understand documentation. I understand how small decisions compound over time. At work, I'm the person people underestimate at first, and then quietly rely on once they realize nothing moves without my approval. At home, I had never applied that same awareness. Until now. I started by reviewing my own life as if it belonged to someone else. No emotion, no judgment, just facts. Income, assets, obligation, relationships, patterns of dependency, both mine and others. What I saw surprised me. I wasn't struggling. I hadn't been for a long time. I'd simply been quiet about stability because no one had ever asked, and because announcing it felt unnecessary. That quiet had been misinterpreted as a lack, and misinterpretation left uncorrected becomes entitlement. I noticed how often I was expected to contribute in ways that weren't reciprocal. Time, labor, emotional availability, always offered casually, rarely acknowledged. I noticed how decisions were made without consulting me, even when they affected me directly. Travel plans, shared expenses, family obligations. Not maliciously, just conveniently, so I stopped being convenient. Gradually, invisibly, I began declining things I would have automatically agreed to before, politely, without explanation. I stopped volunteering information. I stopped smoothing over tension that wasn't mine to manage. And I paid attention to the reaction. Confusion mostly, mild annoyance, occasionally surprise. But no one confronted me. They weren't used to confronting me. I wasn't someone they believed capable of drawing boundaries. In the background, I began preparing for something I couldn't yet name, but knew would require independence in its fullest sense. I reviewed legal documents I'd signed years earlier without much thought. I updated beneficiaries. I separated accounts that had been loosely shared out of convenience or tradition. I didn't announce any of this. People who don't expect you to have agency don't look for evidence of it. Meanwhile, my mother continued speaking about me in familiar ways. Each comment added clarity to the picture I was assembling. She believed I needed protection, from risk, from ambition, from discomfort. And perhaps in her mind, she was right. But protection that costs you your voice is not care. It's control softened by concern. The more I observed, the less personal it felt. This wasn't about me failing to be enough. It was about a system that required me to be small in order to function smoothly. Once I saw that, the emotional charge disappeared. I wasn't angry at my mother anymore. I wasn't hurt by the comments. I was finished. Finished explaining, finished adjusting, finished participating in my own diminishment. What they never noticed was that while they were comfortable with who they thought I was becoming someone else entirely, without changing my tone, my demeanor, or my behavior in any obvious way. There was no announcement, no declaration, just quiet preparation. And when preparation happens in silence, it often looks like nothing at all, right up until the moment it changes everything. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden discovery, no shocking document sliding across a table, no moment where I had to sit down and steady myself. It was quieter than that. It came in the form of a pattern, finally making complete sense. I was reviewing paperwork one evening, old files, emails, and agreements that had accumulated over the years. Things I had signed, accepted, or agreed to because that's just how it's always been done in our family. As I read through everything carefully, without the emotional fog I once carried, a realization settled in. I had far more leverage than anyone believed. Not because someone had wronged me illegally, not because there was a secret betrayal waiting to be exposed, but because I had been positioned, again and again, as the responsible one without being given authority to match that responsibility. And that imbalance created openings. I noticed how often I had been listed as a fallback, an emergency contact, a financial buffer, the person who would handle it if something went wrong. Yet in conversation, I was treated as if I were barely managing my own life. That contradiction mattered. Quietly, I confirmed what I suspected. I consulted professionals, not to complain, not to accuse, but to understand my position clearly. What obligations were real? Which ones were assumed? Where my consent had been implied instead of explicitly given. What I learned was simple and unsettling. Much of what I had been carrying was optional. I didn't feel triumphant when I realized this. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt calm, because clarity removes the emotional noise that keeps you stuck. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't about exposing hypocrisy. It was about choice, finally seeing where I actually had it. And I saw something else too. My mother's narrative about me being poor, simple, low maintenance, had made everyone comfortable relying on me without question. After all, someone with so little who asks for so little surely wouldn't mind giving more. That story had protected them, not me. The private reveal wasn't a weapon, it was a mirror. I saw exactly how I had been woven into family systems as a stabilizer, not a stakeholder. How my quiet competence had been used without acknowledgement, and how my silence had made that usage invisible. And in that moment, I made a decision, not about confrontation, about withdrawal. I would stop offering what was never truly requested. I would stop accepting obligations framed as expectations. I would stop allowing others to define my limits. No speeches, no ultimatums, Just alignment between what I gave and what I chose. The clarity was almost peaceful, like finally understanding the rules of a game you'd been playing blindfolded. I didn't rush into action. I didn't change anything overnight. Because when you understand leverage, you don't need to hurry. You move deliberately. Once you see clearly, the hardest part isn't what to do. It's choosing how to do it. After the private reveal, I spent weeks in what I can only describe as deliberate stillness, not avoidance, consideration. I laid out every option available to me as if I were advising someone else. I could confront my mother directly, explain how her words had hurt me, correct the narrative publicly, demand acknowledgement. I imagined those conversations carefully, the tone I would use, the likely responses, the subtle deflections, the way concern would be weaponized into a justification. I didn't mean it like that. You're being too sensitive. I was just trying to help. I knew those scripts well. Confrontation would give me momentary release, but it would also keep me inside the same system, still negotiating for recognition. Another option was distance, less contact, fewer family gatherings, a quiet exit. That felt tempting, clean, simple, but it also felt incomplete because distance would change my life, but it wouldn't correct the imbalance. It would simply remove me from it, leaving the narrative intact. Then there was the option that unsettled me most, doing nothing visible, continuing exactly as I was, but changing everything underneath. Not explaining, not correcting, not withdrawing emotionally, just stepping out of the role. This option required patience, discipline, trust in process rather than reaction. It also carried risk. People don't always respond well when you stop being what they rely on. But that was precisely the point. I realized that the real choice wasn't about how to respond to humiliation. It was about whether I wanted to remain accessible to it. And accessibility is a decision. So I chose the irreversible path, not the loud one, not the emotionally satisfying one. The one that changed my position permanently, without asking anyone's permission. I would no longer participate in systems that diminished me, even politely. I didn't announce this choice. I didn't frame it as self-respect or empowerment. I simply began acting as if my time, resources, and presence required the same consideration as everyone else's. That meant saying no without explanation. That meant declining responsibilities that weren't mine. That meant letting consequences unfold without rushing in to soften them. It wasn't cold. It wasn't cruel. It was neutral. And neutrality is powerful when people are used to your compliance. This decision felt heavy at first, not because it was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. I had spent so long adapting that standing firm felt almost selfish. But selfishness, I was learning, is often just selfhood seen from the wrong angle. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold. I didn't predict outcomes. I didn't anticipate reactions. I trusted the structure I had built, the clarity, the preparation, the quiet resolve. And once the decision was made, something unexpected happened. I felt light, because I was no longer waiting to be understood. I was ready to move. Once the decision was made, everything else became procedural. That's the part people rarely talk about, the phase after clarity, before consequence. It isn't dramatic, it doesn't feel powerful, it feels almost boring, which is why no one noticed. I didn't cut anyone off. I didn't announce new boundaries. I didn't suddenly become distant or cold. On the surface, I remained exactly the same. Calm voice, polite responses, predictable presence. But underneath, I stopped compensating. When family plans were made without consulting me, I no longer rearranged my schedule to fit them. If I couldn't attend, I said so simply. No apology, no alternative suggestions, just a statement. When my mother hinted that I might help out with something, rides, logistics, small financial gaps, I paused before answering. Sometimes I declined. Sometimes I asked questions I'd never asked before. How much? By when? Who else is involved? Those questions alone change the tone. People are comfortable relying on you when your help is automatic. The moment it becomes conditional, they become aware of the cost. At the same time, I quietly completed the practical work I'd begun weeks earlier. I finalized separations that had long been blurred by habit, accounts, shared responsibilities, informal expectations that had never been formally agreed upon. I didn't dramatize these changes. I framed them as efficiency, organization, long overdue updates. No one questioned that. They never had. What struck me most during this period was how invisible preparation really is. People assume nothing is happening when there's no emotional display. They equate calm with stasis. But calm is often the clearest state for decisive action. I continued showing up to family events. I smiled. I listened. I responded when spoken to. But I stopped filling the silence, stopped volunteering labor, stopped translating emotions for others. And slowly, very slowly, the system began to strain. Someone missed a detail I would have caught. A plan fell apart that I would have quietly stabilized. A small inconvenience grew larger because I didn't step in to absorb it. No one blamed me at first. They couldn't. I hadn't refused anything outright. I had simply stopped anticipating needs that were never mine to carry. That's the thing about moving in silence. You don't announce your absence. You let others feel it. My mother was the first to notice something was different. Not consciously, but instinctively. She asked more questions, checked in more often. "Everything okay?" she'd ask. "You seem busy," she'd say. I assured her I was fine, which was true. But I didn't fill the space beyond that. Silence, when no longer apologetic, makes people uneasy. And unease is the beginning of awareness. At this stage, nothing had happened yet. No confrontation, no fallout, just subtle shifts, gaps where I used to be, friction where things used to slide. I stayed steady, because this part required endurance, not reaction. I understood now that systems resist change quietly at first. They test, they probe, they wait for you to revert. I didn't. And that's when the consequences began to surface. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came the way structural problems always do, incrementally, almost politely, before anyone realizes they're real. At first, it showed up as a mild inconvenience. A family dinner started late because no one coordinated arrival times. A small payment was overlooked because the person who usually tracked it assumed someone else would. A relative missed an appointment because the reminder they'd come to rely on never arrived. None of these things was dramatic. They were brushed off with laughter, excuses, and mild irritation. But I noticed something immediately. No one said my name. Not to blame, not in recognition, just absence. That told me everything. Because when a system breaks down, and no one even thinks to look for you, it means they never saw you as a participant, only as a function. Over time, the inconveniences compounded. A bigger plan fell apart because too many details were left unhandled. A financial assumption didn't hold because I hadn't quietly covered the gap. A conversation turned tense because I didn't step in to smooth it over. And still I said nothing. I answered questions when asked. I clarified only what directly involved me. I never said I used to handle that. I never reminded anyone of what I'd contributed before. I let them feel the weight of the gap without explaining its origin. That's when confusion set in. People started speaking in vague terms. Things feel more complicated lately. Everyone seems so busy. I don't know why this is harder than it used to be. My mother in particular grew unsettled. She didn't accuse me of anything. She couldn't. There was nothing to accuse. Instead, she started reaching for reassurance. "You're okay, right? You know you can always talk to me. You haven't been upset about anything, have you?" I answered honestly. "I'm fine." And what she felt wasn't my distress. It was her loss of control over the narrative. Because the version of me she'd been telling people about, the easy one, the low-need one, the background stabilizer, was no longer functioning as expected. But instead of questioning that version, she tried to restore it. She made small comments again, casual ones, almost nostalgic. "Claire's always been so dependable. She doesn't like fuss. She's good at managing things." This time the comments landed differently, because now they weren't descriptions. They were wishes. I could see the moment it dawned on her. Not fully, not consciously, but enough to create discomfort. The room no longer moved the same way around me. People hesitated before making assumptions. They checked details they hadn't before. They started noticing the work behind outcomes. And with that awareness came something else. Regret. Not for what had been said, not for how I'd been treated, but for what they'd lost access to. When people benefit from your quiet competence, they don't miss you when you step back. They miss the ease. And ease, once gone, is impossible to recreate by force. I stayed steady through all of it. I didn't take satisfaction in the disruption. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. Because this wasn't punishment. It was alignment. The consequences weren't something I inflicted. They were simply what happened when I stopped preventing them. Panic doesn't always look like panic. In families like mine, it looks like overfunctioning. Sudden concern. A flurry of messages framed as care. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, they were already too late. It started with small attempts to restore the old rhythm. My mother called more often. Not to ask questions, just to talk, to reconnect, she said, to check in. She began offering help I hadn't asked for, suggestions, advice, little reminders of how close we were supposed to be. You don't have to do everything on your own, she told me one afternoon. I know, I replied. That answer unsettled her more than resistance would have, because resistance invites argument. Certainty leaves no opening. Other relatives followed suit, though less directly. Invitations came with more enthusiasm. Requests were framed more carefully. People waited for my response instead of assuming it. But none of it addressed the core issue. No one asked why things had changed. No one acknowledged the assumptions that had been made. No one revisited the moment where my dignity had quietly been placed on the table and laughed at. They were trying to fix the effects without examining the cause, and that never works. At some point, my mother finally approached the subject, not head-on, but sideways, as she always did. I hope you know, she said, that if I ever said anything that came out wrong, I didn't mean it that way. It was an opening, carefully constructed, conditional. If I wanted reconciliation in the old sense, this was the moment to take it. I could have reassured her. I could have softened the truth. I could have restored comfort by minimizing myself again. But that comfort had always been one-sided, so I didn't rush to fill the silence. I know you didn't mean harm, I said calmly, but intention doesn't change how things land. She nodded, a little stiffly, waiting for me to continue. I didn't. That was the moment she realized something fundamental had shifted. The version of me that explained, reassured, absorbed, that version wasn't coming back. And suddenly she wanted to fix things. She asked more questions, tried to revisit old conversations, framed them as misunderstandings rather than patterns. But understanding requires honesty. And honesty would have meant admitting that her version of me had been convenient. That was a truth she wasn't ready to face. So she hovered in the in-between, apologetic without accountability, concerned without reflection. And I stayed where I was, calm, clear, unaffected by distortion. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't punitive. It was simply too late to go back. Because once you've seen how easily your dignity can be traded for comfort, you can't unsee it. And once you stop playing a role, no amount of nostalgia can force you back into it. They wanted the old balance restored. I wanted something else entirely. Not distance, not dominance, just reality. And reality doesn't negotiate. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't resemble anything I had once imagined. There was no raised voice, no tears, no dramatic unveiling of grievances carefully stored for years. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in my mother's kitchen, the same kitchen where so many of my silences had been formed. She was making tea. I was sitting at the table, hands folded loosely in front of me. The atmosphere was quiet, not tense, just deliberate. She spoke first. I feel like you've been pulling away, she said carefully, and I don't understand why. I let the pause stretch, not as a tactic, but because I wanted my words to arrive without charge. I haven't been pulling away, I said. I've been standing where I actually am. She frowned slightly. I don't know what that means. I nodded. I know. That answer unsettled her. She set the kettle down harder than necessary. I've always tried to look out for you, she said. If I ever joked about things, it was never meant to hurt. I believe that, I replied. But it still shaped how people treated me. Her eyes met mine then, searching, defensive, afraid. I don't think that's fair, she said. I'm not asking you to think it's fair, I said evenly. I'm explaining why I stopped compensating. The word landed between us. Compensating. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. For years, I continued, I made things easier. I absorbed comments. I adjusted expectations. Not because I couldn't handle more, but because it was simpler than challenging the story you were telling. Her shoulders stiffened. I was just being honest. And that's the problem, I said gently. Honesty without consent is still exposure. She didn't argue. She couldn't. This wasn't an accusation. It was a description. I don't need an apology, I added. I needed the narrative to stop. So I stepped out of it. She sat down slowly, as if the weight of that finally registered. You could have told me, she said quietly. I did, I replied, just not with words. Silence settled between us. Not hostile, but irrevocable. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive anymore. She was grieving. Not me, but the version of me she thought she knew. And I let her. Because grief is the price of adjustment. I don't know how to talk about you now, she admitted. I offered a small, sad smile. You don't have to talk about me. You can talk to me. That was the closest thing to a resolution we reached. No dramatic reconciliation, no clean ending. Just understanding, partial, imperfect but real. And that was enough. Who I am now looks very similar to who I was before, at least from the outside. I still speak softly. I still listen more than I talk. I still choose simplicity where it suits me. I haven't reinvented my life or adopted a louder version of myself to prove a point. The difference is internal. I no longer confuse calm with compliance. I understand now that being underestimated is not always an insult. It's often an invitation. An invitation to give more than you receive, to carry weight without acknowledgement, to accept definitions that serve others better than they serve you. I don't accept those invitations anymore. My relationships are quieter now, but they are clearer. I no longer preemptively make things easy for people who haven't considered my position. I wait to be asked. I wait to be included. And if I'm not, I let that information stand on its own. My mother and I still speak. Our conversations are different, more careful, more direct. She doesn't joke about my life anymore. She asks questions she never asked before. Sometimes she still hesitates, as if unsure where the boundaries are. I don't rush to reassure her, not out of cruelty, but because reassurance used to cost me my voice. What surprised me most was how little anger I carried forward. I'd expected to feel hardened. Instead, I felt lighter. Because anger binds you to the thing you're resisting. Clarity frees you from it. I didn't win anything in the traditional sense. There was no public apology, no moment where everyone suddenly understood. But something more durable happened. The narrative lost its power. People no longer speak for me. They no longer assume access to my time or resources. They check. They pause. And in those pauses, respect grows, not because it was demanded, but because it became necessary. I've learned that dignity doesn't require visibility. It requires alignment. When your actions match your values, the need to explain disappears. I don't regret staying silent for as long as I did. That silence taught me how to listen, truly listen, to what people reveal when they think you aren't paying attention. But I also don't romanticize it. Silence is only strength when it's chosen. And now every quiet moment in my life is deliberate. If there's a moral to this story, it isn't about standing up at the right moment or saying the perfect thing. It's about understanding where your power actually lives. For a long time, I believed dignity came from endurance, from being patient, flexible, unbothered. I thought that if I could absorb discomfort quietly, I was proving strength. But what I learned is this: endurance without choice slowly turns into erasure. Humiliation hurts most when it's framed as truth, when it's delivered calmly, with a smile, in the language of just being honest. Because it leaves you with no obvious enemy, only the unsettling feeling that your worth is being discussed as if it were public property. What changed my life wasn't confrontation. It was consent. I stopped consenting to being spoken for. I stopped consenting to being the easiest option. I stopped consenting to definitions that made me smaller than I am. And I did it without drama. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering anyone. It's about withdrawing your energy from places where it's being used without care. It's about letting systems reveal themselves once you stop holding them together. Some people will call that selfish, others will call it cold. I call it honest. Because honesty isn't just about saying what you think. It's about living in a way that doesn't require constant self-betrayal. If you've ever been publicly diminished by someone who claimed to love you, if you've ever been labeled easy, simple, or low maintenance, when what they really meant was convenient, if you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, and later realized the peace was one-sided, then I hope this story offered you something, not a script, not a strategy, but permission. Permission to step out of the role you never agreed to play. Permission to let silence be a choice, not a cage. Permission to trust that clarity, applied patiently, is stronger than any outburst. You don't owe anyone access to your inner life. You don't owe explanations to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. And you don't have to humiliate anyone back to reclaim your dignity. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do: simply stop making it easy for others to overlook you. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that the version of you others relied on wasn't the one you chose to be?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.